Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the final event of our Veritas series for Faith and Culture this evening, a lecture that we are certain to enjoy. My name is Melissa Page Nichols, and I'm the pastoral counselor in campus ministry here at King's University College. It's my pleasure to be a part of organizing this series with my colleague, Father Michael Béchard. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Father Daniel Horan is a Franciscan friar of Holy Name Province, the New York province, a columnist for America magazine, and the author of several books, including, most recently, The Last Words of Jesus, a meditation on love and suffering, Francis of Assisi and the Future of Faith, exploring Franciscan spirituality and theology in the modern world, and Dating God, Live and Love in the Way of St. Francis. Two other recent titles are The Franciscan Heart of Thomas Merton, a new look at the spiritual influence of his life, thought, and writing, and Postmodernity and Univocity, a critical account of radical orthodoxy and John Donne's Scotus. Father Horan is the author of dozens of scholarly and popular articles and a frequent lecturer and retreat director around the United States and Europe. He has previously taught in the Department of Religious Studies at Siena College and in the Department of Theology at St. Bonaventure University. Father Horan is currently completing a doctorate in systematic theology at Boston College, is the Catholic chaplain at Babson College in Wesley, Massachusetts, and serves on the board of directors of the International Thomas Merton Society. Father Horan's lecture for this evening is entitled Connecting to Faith and Spirituality in the Digital Age, a Franciscan Perspective. It is now my great honor to introduce to you Father Daniel Horan.
Thank you, Melissa. I'd first like to begin by expressing my thanks and gratitude to Father Michael Béchard and Melissa Page Nichols, to Dr. Sylvester, your principal, and of course, the whole team of King's College for the invitation to speak with you this evening. I'm also wanting to express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to the London Catholic School Board for their hospitality earlier this evening and for your support of this lecture. I thank you very much for your generosity and continued support of this lecture series. So in communicating with Melissa about the logistics and what technical needs I might have in anticipation of this evening's talk, my initial instinct was naturally to plan a PowerPoint presentation. How many people, too, if you had to be up here at this stage with the possibility of a giant screen behind you, would do the same, right? Yeah, that's what a good number of the crowd. But I hesitated. It seemed that it might be more impactful, if maybe a little ironic, if instead I presented in an old-fashioned, low-tech, human-to-human lecture style. And so this evening, like an emperor with a new wardrobe, I stand before you without a fancy projector to hide behind. And for that reason, I'm happy to say, you're welcome, and I'm sorry. I'd like to begin by thinking back a few years to an article that I read in September of 2011 that appeared in the New York Times. This article bore the title, Facebook Page for Jesus with Highly Active Fans. The story focused on the hobby of a North Carolina doctor who was the son of an American preacher in the southern states of the U.S. Having begun using Facebook just a few years earlier, he decided to promote not just his diet book and diet plan, which is why he got on Facebook, but he decided to create a Facebook page called Jesus Daily. Does anyone here like that page, Jesus Daily? No, I don't think I do either. That's okay. But what drew the attention of the New York Times at that time, what captured their attention, was that more people had liked the Facebook page of this Jesus Daily than any other Facebook page in the whole Facebook world, including, the article noted, your fellow compatriot from the north here and native Londoner, Justin Bieber. I understand he's from not so far away. I should report, though, that was a few years ago that this article came out. Bieber has now surpassed Jesus on Facebook, so that's no longer the issue. So on the one hand, it shouldn't be all that surprising that a web page that's dedicated to Jesus could boast of more than 8 million fans, given that Christianity is, at least for the time being, still the largest religion on the planet. Yet, on the other hand, we are left wondering what the short and long-term implications of new social media might be for religion in the 21st century. In that same article, the Times makes a similar observation about where is this going. The author writes, Facebook and other social media tools have changed the way people communicate, the way people work, the way people find each other, the way people fall in love. Now, while it's too early to say that social media may have transformed the way people practice religion, the number of people discussing faith on Facebook has significantly increased in the last year, the article goes on to say. It seems that nearly everyone can agree that almost every aspect of our lives has been impacted in one form or another by technology. And it's been impacted particularly in this time, this period of time that I would like to call the digital age. It also seems safe to say that technology has impacted the way we think about and practice our faith. And I'm interested today in exploring some of the ways that my tradition, my religious tradition as a Franciscan friar in the Roman Catholic Church, how the Franciscan tradition might engage or be attentive to the shifting social and emotional and spiritual contexts of this age. Among the many ways such a consideration could proceed, I propose taking a look at 3 areas. These 3 areas will kind of highlight, I hope, the nexus between an 800-year-old spiritual tradition and the immediate reality of our contemporary experience. And in doing so, I want to respect both the positive and the negative dimensions of what we discover. So these are the 3 areas I want to look at, drawing from the Franciscan tradition in particular. The first is the evangelical and missionary vocation of Christians. The second is the tradition's call, particularly the Franciscan spiritual call, to renounce power. And finally, the centrality of the incarnation and the blessing of embodiment in Franciscan spirituality in particular. Now, this first of the 3 areas is what I would call a positive exhortation, and you'll see what I mean in just a moment. The second is more of a cautionary tale, maybe slowing down a little bit, not so quick to rush in. And then the third is more challenging. It's indeed a challenge, and one to both the Christian and broader communities concerning technology. So this talk will therefore not be an explicit endorsement, nor will it be a condemnation of new social media, the latest technology, or anything of this sort. If you're with your iPhone or Droid or smartphone or laptop or iPad or Amazon Fire or so on and so on and so on with you right now, I understand there are some gentlemen in the audience who are live tweeting this per an assignment. That's what they say. I think they're just Facebooking or texting. But if you want to follow the live tweet or participate, this was not part of the plan. You'll see that our whole lives have been impacted in this way, and that we can follow along perhaps in a similar, live moment of social media. It's not an endorsement, but it's not a negative critique either, not explicitly. Like so much in the Catholic Christian tradition, I believe that the wisdom of the Franciscan tradition, the wisdom that arises both with Francis of Assisi and Clare of Assisi and those who will come to follow them, offers us a more nuanced both-and approach. It's a both-and approach for us to live more authentically our faith and our baptismal mission in a digital age. So this first business, right? Number 1, my point about evangelical and missionary vocation. Francis of Assisi, on his deathbed, lectured to his brothers. He dictated his final reflections as he reflected on his life. And at one point he says, "And after the Lord gave me brothers, no one showed me what I was to do. But the Most High himself revealed to me that I should live according to the pattern of the Holy Gospel." At the heart of the Franciscan way of being in the world stands the simple summary statement: Franciscan life is gospel life. I often say in talks about Franciscan spirituality that people have been sold a bill of goods, and I'm always sorry to be the messenger of what seems like bad news, because people always love the Franciscans, right? They love St. Francis. Everybody has him in their garden, and the birds come and take a little bath and so on. But unlike our dear Benedictine brothers and sisters who have a very distinctive spirituality, a life that's centered around prayer and work, ora et labora, the Jesuits who have their examen and the spiritual exercises and like to talk about that all the time. Those of you who've gone to Jesuit schools know what I'm talking about. I'm at one right now, so I feel like it's. I also work for a Jesuit magazine, as Melissa pointed out, so I get to jab them every now and then. All these religious traditions have something that's distinctive, distillable, kind of easily packaged and presentable. This is what makes us different. And we Franciscans have nothing. Because, as I just said, when distilled to its most basic core, the Franciscan life is simply gospel life. So central is this evangelical quality of living in the world that the rule, which is the official way of life, the instruction book for how to be a Franciscan, that St. Francis wrote, it begins by saying this very basically, very simply. The rule in life of the lesser brothers is this: to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ by living in obedience without anything of one's own and in chastity, period. It goes on, but that's how it begins. The Franciscan First Order, the Friars Minor, those of us who wear these very fashionable 800-year-old still-in-style outfits, we're not the only ones, and we're not that unique within the whole Franciscan family. All of the branches of the Franciscan family in this regard, the religious and the secular, the male and the female, everyone who professes to be a Franciscan after the example of Francis and Clare of Assisi includes this gospel or evangelical imperative as the starting point for their way of living in the world. It's almost verbatim in every single rule. So in looking at the foundation for the Franciscan movement, we have to remember that Francis of Assisi, first and foremost, had no intention of starting a religious community, let alone about a bazillion that actually exists today, right? What kind of Franciscan are you? I get sometimes. I was just talking with a wonderful woman whose brother is a Franciscan who belongs to the same order that I do. There are 3 first orders. This is a very quick and confusing lesson. There's the OFMs, like me. There's the OFM conventuals, and there are the OFM Capuchins. And he's an OFM like me. His headquarters and some of the other ministries that they have overlap with the same ones that my province does on the east coast of the U.S. and up into Canada, into Quebec, into, to Toronto, as far west as Toronto. And we're actually in 2 different provinces. So even though we're in same geographic territory, we're divided in some way, jurisdictionally anyway. So it's very confusing. What's with all these Franciscans? So Francis had no intention 800 years ago of starting this, let alone what it's become. Instead, what Francis of Assisi started out doing was living his own spiritual experience of conversion. It was an experience that led to a change of life that reflected what was happening to him personally. There's a Franciscan scholar named Regis Armstrong who has remarked that what Francis was seeking in his particular way of living in the world stemmed from his baptismal vocation, the call that all Christian women and men receive. Francis was interested first and foremost in how to live rightly, which meant striving to follow more authentically Jesus' instruction in the gospel. What quickly happened, though, and this will happen when you're trying to live the gospel authentically, like another guy named Francis who wears a lot of white over in Rome. When you're doing it well, when you're doing it right, when you put the gospel in Christ first and not yourself, people catch on. People become fascinated, and quickly, others witness this change in Francis of Assisi's life. They too wanted in. They wanted what this guy had. What is it about him? Why is he so happy? Why is he so joyful? And they began to approach Francis. They looked for advice, and they asked him about the possibility of joining him. They too, it seemed, felt called to follow a similar course of gospel living. It was only then that Francis had to confront this reality, that there was a change in plans. And it was then that Francis appears to have realized the need to organize some set of rules, some sort of guidance, and it took him almost 20 years to do that. Everything that is used to describe this particular way of living in the world, what Francis set out to do and that other people also wanted to do, would become known as Franciscan, would become located with the Franciscan spirit and the identity of Francis of Assisi. Anything at all that has anything to do with it is always centered on observing the Holy Gospel. And we modern Franciscans, and those of us from Francis of Assisi to me today in 2015 and those who will come after me, we do this to better or lesser degrees. Francis did it pretty well. I think Pope Francis is doing it pretty well too. But very early on in this newly emerging community, this new religious way of living, there was a set of friars, and to a lesser extent, scholars point out sisters too, but there were friars who wanted to go beyond the geographical confines of Assisi and the early boundaries of this community to bring the gospel life to other parts of the known world. This, in a sense, mirrored Francis's own lived example of transcending the interpersonal and the cultural confines of his society and his class. One of the most startling aspects of Francis's early conversion was his sudden willingness to embrace the outcast and the marginalized. And these were people that typically are described as lepers. But it wasn't just the lepers. It was all who were pushed to the margins. Such was also the case later in life when Francis and a companion crossed the threshold of the Muslim world to peaceably engage the Sultan in prayerful, constructive, and fraternal dialogue at a time during the Fifth Crusade when Western Christianity was at war with these very same people. Something about living the gospel led Francis to move beyond what was comfortable, move beyond what society said was okay, to meet people where they are, to recognize that they were brothers and sisters. Whether it was a more explicit rendering of the gospel imperative that we read in Matthew's version to go out to all the nations, if that was the reason that Francis sought to live out, or whether it was simply a result of the freedom that comes with following the gospel and being open to the Spirit, we don't know. But Francis and his brothers traversed the borders of lands, of religions, of cultures even, in order to establish and support relationships in new territories. And this, I believe, is what we can call the missionary and evangelical vocation of the Franciscan way of life. Emerging from a commitment then to follow in the teaching and footprints of Jesus Christ, this way of being, this disposition that orients the believer outward and toward others, as opposed to inward and focused on the self, was the primary motivation. Like Jesus in the Gospels, Francis saw an inherent value in not acquiring the security and comfort afforded by the appropriation of property and resources and status. Made emblematic in his renunciation of his father's wealth and social position, in that famous scene where Francis strips naked in the town square in front of the mayor and the bishop and his family. Talk about embarrassing. Good thing there weren't live tweeting going on at that time. There were no live tweets. Francis rejected time and again the structures and the system that defined relationship in his day. These same structures and systems elevated certain families to places of nobility and wealth, while still subjugating others to be marginalized and powerless, to places of poverty, places of social dislocation. The friars were always and everywhere committed at that time to standing at the margins of society in order to enter into relationship with those for whom ordinary means of social interaction was prevented, forbidden, or somehow abridged. Oh yeah, you can come today. Don't come back tomorrow. Oh yeah, you can participate in this community. You have to stay outside the walls. The friars saw in this call to live the gospel life a mandate that compelled them to missionary activity, to break down those walls, those barriers. It's important to recall that despite the very real concerns and ill effects of the history of colonization in our world, the term mission itself and its origins finds its origin in the ordered and intentional sending forth. It's the commissioning, the sending forth of somebody or a community for a particular political or religious or social goal. It can be hard at times. We hear mission or missionary, or missionary, and we think about 1492, or we think about all the terrible things that resulted in terms of treatment of native peoples, or we think about colonization. But trying to hold that aside, the terrors notwithstanding, the term itself means to go forward, to be missional. And the gospel, as it were, was that which sent, that which commissioned the friars to go forth into the world to serve the church in a very particular way. The goal of the brothers was always that of solidarity with all people, as I've been saying. It is no wonder then that the Franciscans quickly became some of the most popular preachers and confessors in their day. The reason was they were willing to incorporate contemporary or popular culture into the explication of the Christian faith. And combined, as it were, with their stance of humility, they never sought to threaten others by their undisclosed agendas or ambitions. Again, to greater or lesser degrees. Certainly this was true with Francis. This led to a popularity and accessibility that was rarely seen before in Christian ministry. It was in the 13th century with the Franciscans and with the Dominicans in particular that this whole idea of mendicancy, this idea of itineracy, this idea of getting outside the cloister, getting outside the parish rectory, no offense, Father Béchard, into with other people. Now, that's changed. Secular clergy, diocesan priests, other religious communities, even cloistered communities welcome people in much more now than perhaps they did many centuries ago. But it was something new was going on. In many of the same ways, Franciscan women and men of our own day continue to be popular preachers and retreat leaders, educators, and pastoral ministers. For better or worse, where I come from, many Franciscan parishes and ministerial centers are viewed as destination churches. Have you heard of that expression before? Maybe it's an American thing. A destination church is a place where people are willing to travel some distance to participate in the life of this community. Oftentimes they travel past local parish, past local parish, past local parish to go to a place where they feel maybe just a little more welcome. This is in several ways a contemporary parochial and I think pastoral iteration of what was experienced by those first friars early on. And it's not all that unusual for Franciscans to be associated with innovative and novel ministries. Now, I'm not just saying this to be like, rah, rah, the friars are so awesome. I'm getting to a point. Stay with me. We can think, though, of the history of the Christian community and the Catholic Church in particular in terms of interreligious dialogue. One thinks of the long-standing Franciscan presence in the Holy Land that goes back 800 years. The Catholic keepers of a lot of the Holy Land sites are run by Franciscans. You can think back to John Paul II in, I think it was 1982 or 1986, when he held the International Interreligious Day of Prayer on October 4th at the chapel. It's called the Portiuncula at Our Lady of the Angels, just outside of Assisi. You've probably seen that picture before of him standing before the little chapel that Francis saw as his home with religious leaders from around the world. There's a reason he went there. We can think of direct service to the poor and marginalized. At least in the States, one thinks of some of the first HIV and AIDS ministries in the 1980s. There's missionary work abroad and the like. There's just a lot of different things. It tends to be something about returning to the gospel life that compels people to try new things. Reminds me of a certain Bishop of Rome again. It only seems fitting that as friars have for centuries embraced the challenge and the joy of serving the church and the world in new ways, on new frontiers, that Franciscans and Franciscan-hearted people, and if we remember, to be Franciscan means to follow the gospel, so really all Christians, that we all might be compelled or inspired to go to a new territory to be on the front lines, a new territory that's in need of pastoral care, that's in need of evangelical engagement. This new territory, it's called the internet. In some ways, the internet and all new social media has spawned, Twitter, Instagram, maybe not Yik Yak. Is that a thing up here? I've read about it in the New York Times, but I haven't actually seen it. Do you guys know it? Okay, good. Don't stay away. No, I don't know enough about it, but I'm not hearing good things. It allows people to post anonymously about other people. And it's based on GPS location so that you can only post about people that you're within. So like in this room, if you had these apps, as I understand it, you could be posting anonymous nasty things about me or your neighbor right now. And that those people could find out and all the people around here could see it. It's like a micro Twitter or something. It sounds not good. The internet is a new frontier, and it's good and it's bad. It is the great equalizer, though, in our history. Although nothing in life is entirely egalitarian, the World Wide Web has revolutionized the manner in which information is accessed, the way that communication is carried out, and the way that business is transacted. I was at a store in downtown London just last evening, and the guy said to me, "How would you like to pay? Do you have," I don't even know what the name of it is, but something where you can tap your smartphone to something. That's all the internet. That's all new technology. But more broadly, where once most people were subject to more arcane structures of social interaction, limitations on access to news information, restrictions on communication and regulation to the realm of the voiceless in society, where the powerful few were heard, now anyone with access to a computer and the internet can conceivably engage in public and constructive and sometimes unconstructive discourse that was previously unimaginable. For some of the students here, maybe it is in fact unimaginable. You only remember the internet. I may look very young, and in fact I am pretty young, but I still remember a time where my family didn't have a computer at home. It wasn't until I was in middle school or junior high that we first had a computer, and it wasn't until I was in college that my family had the internet at home. That time once existed, people. Some folks here know what I mean. But it was previously unimaginable. I think this was said best by the advertising industry's standard publication, a magazine called Adweek, in which there was an article about new social media and high fashion. And this article said that digital is democratizing. It's about accessibility. The brand image for high-end fashion is all about inaccessibility, right? It keeps the masses out so that people who can afford to buy their way in feel that they're exceptional. That's the whole point of the advertising, right? Beyond the potential for increased equity brought about by technology in the form of the internet with all of its subsidiary realities, we must also recognize the importance that the identification of a new territory presents to the Christian world. Now, a number of religious leaders in the church, from Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI to the U.S. bishops, and I believe the Canadian bishops, to other local leaders in parishes and other communities, have spoken time and again in recent years now of the need to, quote, evangelize the internet by bringing the gospel in explicit and implicit ways to this, quote unquote, new world. In fact, in an address in 2010 on the occasion of the 44th World Communications Day, now Pope Emeritus Benedict spoke of what he calls, quote, the important and sensitive pastoral area of digital communications, through which people can discover new possibilities for carrying out their ministry to and for the God. Benedict continued, emphasizing the ministerial imperative present in this new and challenging landscape. He says, responding adequately to this challenge amid today's cultural shifts, to which young people are especially sensitive, necessarily involves using new communications technologies. The world of digital communication, with its almost limitless expressive capacity, makes us appreciate all the more St. Paul's exclamation in the first letter to the Corinthians. St. Paul says, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." The increased availability of the new technologies demands greater responsibility on the part of those who are called to proclaim the gospel. But it also requires them to become more focused, to be more efficient and compelling in their efforts. Priests and other ministers, Benedict says, stand at the threshold of a new era. As new technologies create deeper forms of relationship across greater distances, they are called to respond pastorally by putting the media ever more effectively at the service of the word. Not bad for a senior guy of years and wisdom. What Benedict is very aware of, even now in his retirement, but maybe less aware of now than when he was the Bishop of Rome, what he was aware of when he said these things is the role that technology plays in our contemporary world. As is his famously tweeting and selfie-taking successor, Pope Francis. No longer is the church's engagement with new social media and other forms of digital communication an optional enterprise. It's not something that we can just choose to ignore, but it has become a constitutive element of ministry to God's people in our age. It's become something that you just can't escape. It is indeed, it's truly what it's called, a network. Through the use of technology, Christians are called to reach out to the world within this new environment to bring the word of God into the digital public square. Now, I need to make a qualification, to add a caveat. This is not necessarily an invitation for Christians to simply proselytize, to get online and to tweet and to Facebook comment or Facebook harass people and say, you should be baptized, you should go to church, you should be a Christian, you should do this, you should do that. That's not the point, not explicitly. See, if Francis of Assisi and his friar companion had done that in 1219 in Damietta, Egypt, when trying to talk to the Sultan, they would have ended up like all the other radical missionaries who crossed the borders, only to insult and to verbally, if not physically, attack those brothers and sisters of ours who are Muslim, and they probably would have ended up imprisoned or killed. But Francis walked in and walked out very well. No, we're not called necessarily to proselytize, but we are called to respect the beliefs of so many throughout the world who are present online, observing the sincere desire in each of them for enduring truth and a spirit of the absolute. We're supposed to do this among, as Benedict says in that same address, people of every culture, including those who do not believe. Have you heard this expression, the nuns? Not N-U-N-S, like Sisters of St. Joseph. I mean, N-O-N-E-S. This is an expression that's used sometimes in surveys. It's becoming more and more popular to this country down south, the U.S., where in surveys people can check, oh, I'm Anglican, or I'm Methodist, or I'm Catholic, or I'm N-O-N-E, none. The increasing number of people who are not associated. Benedict says, and others have echoed him over the years since he was Pope, that this is a step to be present to people, to walk with people, not to beat them over the head with the Bible, but to maybe reach out to the disheartened as perhaps a first step of evangelization. Evangelization sometimes gets a dirty name, sort of like proselytizing. It's like a more acceptable euphemism for proselytizing, right? But when I say evangelization, I mean it literally. I mean bringing the good news, in Greek, Evangelion, the good news, the gospel. Similarly, there are others, and there's one, I always have to mention him, an auxiliary bishop from the Diocese of Alexandria in the state of Virginia, down in the U.S. One time he spoke to the U.S. bishops during their annual fall meeting, and he highlighted, this was a couple years after Benedict XVI had made this address, where he was really calling for priests and pastoral ministers and all Christians to take seriously social media and the internet. This bishop picked up on this, and he has some great things to say. He too highlighted the democratizing quality of new social media and the sense in which the internet and other technology is a new territory, what Benedict had called a digital continent. This bishop, Herzog is his name, Ronald Herzog,
reflected on the challenge that the democratizing reality of the internet poses for ministers and members of the faith community. He says, one of the greatest challenges of this culture to the Catholic Church is its egalitarianism. Anyone can create a blog. Everyone's opinion is valid. And if a question or a contradiction is posed, the digital natives, those who are millennials or those who have been born in the mid to late 80s and beyond, people who, as I said earlier, don't remember a time when there wasn't the internet. These people that he calls digital natives, they expect a response in something resembling a conversation. Maybe it doesn't seem like a conversation on Facebook where a bunch of people are going blah, 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 blah. But they want something. They want engagement. Now he says to his fellow bishops that we can choose not to enter into that cultural mindset. We can opt out. But we do so at great peril. We do so at great peril to the church's credibility and the approachability in the minds of these young people, those who are growing up in this new culture. This, he says, is a new form of pastoral ministry. It may not be the platform that we were seeking, but it is an opportunity of such magnitude that we should consider carefully the consequences of disregarding it. What this bishop wisely draws attention to are the shifting power dynamics ushered in by the technology of this digital age. No longer is power limited to the elite, to the clergy, to the wealthy, or to those who have maintained authority. The church, this bishop says, the church, this bishop seems to apply, must reconceive its own identity as something totally different from other institutions and realities. It can no longer think that way. It has to reconceive of something else. It has to transcend the boundaries that were built over centuries of exclusivity and membership, the you are in and you are out mentality. And thereby, the church must enter into engagement with folks from all walks of life. As I've already highlighted, the charismatic impulse for Franciscans, one of the things at the heart of Franciscan spirituality, to live among the marginalized and the otherwise voiceless, and to move beyond the ordinary boundaries of social, cultural, and religious difference, suggests that what these church leaders have been prophetically announcing is an intuitively recognizable opportunity in line with that same Franciscan spirituality. What is already at play in the heart of a tradition that began with a handful of faithful following Francis's model for gospel living aligns well with the need of the world and the church today. What might seem like a novel form of engagement or of preaching or of ministry or of companionship, of being present, is, it would seem, just another expression of what it means to live out the Franciscan spirit in our contemporary world. And as I said earlier, much to the chagrin of my brothers and in a somewhat self-embarrassingly way, there's nothing special about Franciscan spirituality, so that when I talk about it, I'm talking about baptism. I'm talking about Christian vocation. I'm talking about all of us. Although such statements are often dismissed as too speculative or flippant, I often hate this question, particularly in the classroom, like, Father Dan, what would Francis say about such and such? Or what would St. Paul say about such and such? I'm like, well, hold on a second. Let me put on my time machine hat and let you know. So while I recognize it's a little absurd, I think there is some truth in the tradition that supports a claim that if Francis of Assisi were alive today, we might very well find him on Facebook. Yet, and here we get back to reality, because he's not, the responsibility to engage this new digital continent, to engage social media, to reach out to other people, to preach by our deeds, and to proclaim the word to the world, both in our spoken words and in our actions and presence, falls to us. It's our responsibility. That's my first point. The second point, don't worry, points 2 and 3 are much shorter. People looking at their phones, yeah, I'm tweeting, no, I'm checking the time. My second point is, if the first one, just as a reminder, the first one is this kind of compelling sense, this charism, this spirit, this drive into the world to move beyond boundaries, to be sent, to be missioned into spreading the good news, not by beating people over the head with what it is that I believe or what you should believe, but by being there peaceably and patiently and presently. That's the first thing, the first movement. The second one is what I would call peaceability, being a peaceable person and renouncing power. So if the evangelical and missionary vocation compels contemporary men and women to engage the culture of the digital era in ways that honor the egalitarian quality and missionary character of this new world, this new digital continent, as I believe it does, then it represents something of what we might call a green light, a go ahead, all clear, thumbs up. It's a green light for technological ministry today. It's a green light for live tweeting at a presentation such as this. It's a green light for liking me on Facebook, Dan Horan, OFM. No, I'm just kidding. Live tweeting, what a loser. Let's not get carried away. While that's a green light, and there's some encouragement in the tradition to support it, there are clearly positive dimensions, and this is what gives the encouragement in this new ministerial landscape. But there are also cautions that arise out of the tradition that we have to consider in light of the same Franciscan tradition. In other words, along with the green light to go ahead, to enter this continent, to go to the border, to cross it into a new frontier, to not to be afraid to be with other people, to meet them, to live the gospel there, we also find a yellow light, urging careful consideration of this complex reality of the technological or digital age. It is a reminder that discernment must always be taken seriously in any form of ministry, any form of community, or desire to be in relationship. I believe that this yellow light appears in the Franciscan model of peaceable living arising from the renouncement of power. What do I mean? Well, in Francis's time, so join me by putting on your time machine hats and going back 800 years, the renouncement of power for which he is best known takes the form of rejecting the economic and monetary systems of his day. It's very famous in our rule or way of life for the Order of Friars Minor, the first order, that Francis says that no brother should ever touch money. We're not to touch coins. He also says the brothers are not to ride horses. Well, on both points, I tried to be very good, but he never said anything about not using credit cards. Because Visa is everywhere you want to be, right? I'm still cool with the horses thing. I don't ride horses. Anyways, just kidding. Surely this remains an important element of the Franciscan tradition, right? Being resistant toward unthinking, uncritical reflection on the way that the world operates. Franciscan men and women are, at least in part, supposed to, in our own time, 2015, live as prophetic people, committed to speaking out against the systematically sinful nature of capitalism and unbridled consumption. It continues to wreak havoc in our world, and it's something we hear Pope Francis, who I believe really deeply, truly, lives up to his namesake's name, right? Yes, those are big shoes to fill. There's a reason why in 800 years no pope has ever taken the name Francis. It's too scary. But he has spoken too out against capitalism, against consumerism, against this culture of consumption, what he calls at times a throwaway culture. We're so quick to instantly get what we want and then dismiss it, toss it away. Francis of Assisi, 800 years ago, had an intuitive sense of this. There was a time where people were valued based on their family or clan or tribe. Quickly, though, over the course of centuries in Central Europe, they moved from a barter system where, hey, I got a couple chickens, you've got some, I don't know what, tools. They didn't have iPhones, so you couldn't trade for an iPhone 6, but you would barter, you would work things out, you would evaluate things based on what people needed and what people had. This moved more to a mercantile, money-based economy where things, and then very quickly people, became evaluated based on money. This happened in Francis's own life, and he was, in some sense, we might say, a beneficiary of this very phenomenon because he was not part of the noble class. He was not a knight. His father wasn't. He was no part of the nobility. Clare of Assisi did come from a lower noble class. But Francis's father was a wealthy businessman. He had a lot of money. And nobility didn't guarantee you money. Those of you who watch Downton Abbey know that, right? Yeah, I haven't seen season 5 yet, so don't say anything. I don't know. So there's a reason. He understood that this is a problem. Money could become an issue. And so he wanted to get rid of it altogether, reject it. Yet there are additional ways, too, that those of us inspired by the Franciscan spirit can continue to live out the renouncement of power, the power that people have to say who has value, who doesn't, who has access, who doesn't. As it concerns technology and social media, I believe it stems from the how we are supposed to go about living in the digital world, as opposed to the why. What I mean by that is the why has already been given a green light. I think why we should be engaged in social media, and I think we need to think about it and not just do it. We need to be discerning and reflective about it. The why is because there are many opportunities to meet people where they are. They're there. We're there. We're all there now, and we're here. But the how we engage in that digital continent, how we relate to others, that's what's unique here. Among the manifold features of technology that might be classified as good or even neutral presences in our world, there also remains a shadow side to this widely popular and accessible set of tools of the internet and social media. You're familiar with these, right? Identity manipulation, harassment, uncharitable discussion, libelous commenting, the option for anonymity, and so on. All of these things coalesce to create an experience at times of disunity and fear. We've heard so many horror stories of the negative effects that bullying, of this app that I just heard about that I mentioned earlier at the beginning. It's been wreaking havoc on people's lives and their sense of self. So while the internet and social media platforms provide the otherwise voiceless at times with an opportunity to speak and to engage the world, these very same realities provide the condition for contentious disputes, for hateful speech, and for mean-spirited engagement. I believe that whereas the ability to disagree as disrespectfully with others as this is often not been the case in real-time conversations, it's a lot harder when you are in front of another person to say the kind of things that people say online, isn't it? There also isn't that instant effect that you have, that instant kind of feeling or ability to, when you get a thought or you get a question, when you get an angry idea, that you can text the person instantly or post something to their blog or write some comment on, I don't know, the National Post. Isn't that the Toronto paper or something like that? Something terrible. This article was terrible. You would never call up the reporter and say that. Maybe you would. But you can do it anonymously. You can do it very, very painfully. Francis of Assisi's way of living in the world, following in those footprints of Jesus Christ, embracing the gospel, I believe is a model that offers an implicit yet powerful critique of a digital culture that can at times reflect the worst rather than the best of humanity. Time and again in Francis's writings, we read of the saint's insistence that those who desire to live the gospel and follow his way of life, that these people are to be peacemakers in the world. How many people of you know that prayer? Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love, and so on. I hate to break it to you. Francis never wrote that. And that's about a 114-year-old prayer that was written in France at the turn of the 20th century. But that's okay. It has the spirit of what he was really about, because he did write about being peacemakers very, very often. Among the frequent references to peaceable relationship as goal in Francis's writing is a rather direct admonition in the rule, in the way of life that he has for us friars. He says that I counsel, I admonish, and I exhort my brothers in the Lord Jesus Christ not to quarrel or argue or judge others when they go about in the world, but let them be meek. Let them be peaceful, modest, gentle, and humble, speaking courteously to everyone as is becoming. Now, if only my mom had that line when I was a little kid. You're going to be a friar someday, and you should be peaceful and meek and kind and gentle and not a little brat. I was a rambunctious child. Elsewhere in the rule, Francis again highlights the way in which the brothers are to go in the world. This time, using by way of example the experience of the friars encountering each other, he illustrates this point. He writes that wherever the brothers may be and meet one another, let them show that they are members of the same family. It is this fraternal, this familial notion of relationship that guides the way the Franciscans are supposed to encounter one another and encounter all sorts of other people. Yet Francis's most powerful and explicit reference to peacemaking as a central element to gospel living comes in his famous Canticle of the Creatures. I'm sure you've heard of this before. Many of you have, right? There's the old Lutheran-based hymn. It's all creatures of our God and King. You know that one? Yeah, this is being recorded. I hope I don't get sued for copyright violation. Then there's the more popular one, kind of more recently in the spirit of the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s by the composer Marty Haugen. The heavens are telling the glory. Do you sing that up here? Yeah, okay, you know that too. All right, I promise I'll stop singing. I can see the pain on people's faces. Is he drawing his nails on a chalkboard? What's going on up there? Well, the Canticle of the Creatures, in that beautiful poetic prayer, Francis names different elements of the created order, always prefacing the respective part of creation with the family, with the fraternal or sister-related title of brother, sister, and at one point even mother. He calls Earth our mother. Now, it isn't until he gets to the close of the prayer itself, of the canticle, that he fully mentions human beings. Up until that point, Francis had named the ways in which the elements of creation praise God in and through what it is that they were created to be, what God intended them to be. He says that brother sun praises God through providing light. And he says that wind praises God by bringing weather. Unless you live in Boston in February of this year when, gosh, I don't know if that was praise to God, but there was a lot of snow. Up until that point, this is what he's doing, talking about the different aspects of creation, and they're being authentic. They're being what it is God wants them to be. But what is it that human beings are created to do? What are we created to be? How is it that we give praise to God? Francis explains, and this is the last thing he mentions in his whole list. He says, "Praised be you, my Lord, through those, us, who give pardon for your love, and do so bearing infirmity and tribulation. Blessed are those, us, who endure in peace, for by you, Most High, shall they be crowned." Human beings live out their vocation as part of God's inherently good creation, through exercising forgiveness and peace, by being reconcilers, by being people who love. Francis never sought to retreat from or enter into a cloister apart from the world. Instead, the Franciscans, he wanted them to be deeply involved in the life and activity of the world, meeting all sorts of people where they were, at their location, in the marketplace, in the streets, where they were living, and to live among and with them. This refusal to flee the ordinary world was a radical departure from the way that most religious communities lived in those days. So too was Francis's particular way of living in that world. Not just to live in the world, but the way to live in that world, the how one lives in that world. He refused to play by the rules of the world. And by refusing to play by the rules of the world, Francis it permitted him and those who would come after him, it allowed him to reach out to all sorts of people, regardless of their backgrounds, including the voiceless, the marginalized, the overlooked, the discarded. His example offered a sense of hope and direction that sought to reflect the goodness of God that was revealed in Christ and presented in the gospel. For us in today's technological context, there is yet another iteration of Francis's wisdom. We too are challenged to live up to our vocation as part of God's good creation, just like Brother Sun and Sister Moon and the rest. We are to be the peacemakers that God has created us to be in the world, which now includes the frequently contentious world of the internet and of Twitter and of Instagram and of Facebook and things that I don't even know about that are being made right now that someone in this room may be, typing up the code for. We are not only called to dwell among the people of God online and bring our faith onto the digital continent, but we are to do so in peace, while refusing to embrace that lure of power found in the competitive land of technology. It is in this way that our engagement with technology can truly translate the wisdom of the Franciscan tradition, particularly in terms of mission and spirituality, this drive of the gospel, into a modern language for the world that I believe, and many of you may have experienced, so desperately is in need of hearing and receiving some good news, perhaps the good news, the gospel. We are commissioned by virtue of our baptism to be ambassadors of peace and reconcilers of community in our own age. We are to refuse the temptation to quarrel and to attack, to hide behind screen names created for anonymity, to troll. People know what that is? Oh, the trolls have heard me. To do anything that in any way diminishes the dignity of any human person. What the Franciscan tradition offers is a caution, is a yellow light, but it also highlights a mandate. We are to go into this digital world bringing the good news of Christ and the peace of reconcilers. So we've gone green, yellow, what's next? Red, good. Oh, so bashful. See, this is something I usually say sometimes when I preach because I like to wander around. I've been told with the camera and the microphone, and this thing's been causing trouble, not to move too much. But oftentimes I wander around, I come down the pews, and I talk, and I like to ask questions sometimes of the congregation. It makes everybody very uncomfortable, especially if they don't know me. And so then I have to say something like this, and it's so pertinent, it's very relevant given the topic at hand, our faith, our spirituality, and technology, that like you, I spend way too much time in front of screens, little ones, big ones, computer ones, TV ones. And I'm used to the fact that I get to absorb all this information and to watch passively. But here's the kicker. I can see you. We're not on TV yet. I guess we're soon to be on a screen. So green, yellow, and as you quietly, meekfully, peacefully, I'll take it, said red. What is the red light? The red light comes, I believe, in the blessing of embodiment. One of the most persistent challenges to authentic Christianity over the course of nearly 2 millennia has been the appearance and reappearance of a way of thinking most popularly referred to as Manichaeism. Have people heard of this before? Manichaeism? Okay. Don't worry, this isn't actually a pop quiz. There's no test or anything here. So for those who don't know, Manichaeism is an unorthodox view of the human person in creation that advances a very dualistic worldview. It's named for a 3rd century figure who promoted a spirituality rooted in a Platonic worldview that subordinated the created world, the material world, especially human physicality, our fleshiness, our existence, what the second book in Genesis, the second creation narrative, refers to as ha-adamah, from the earth, what it is that we are. This way of thinking subordinates that, puts it down, belittles it, and elevates the world of ideas and those things that are spiritual or of the mind. A common, albeit imperfect, way to summarize a general Manichaean outlook in Christian terms would be to say something like, the human soul, quote unquote, is all that really matters, while the human body is merely an imperfect product, is something that's passing. That's not really Christian. This type of thinking, this Manichaeanism, that which elevates the mind or soul over against the body and the rest of creation, has proven to be immensely popular over the course of history. At various points over the centuries, some form of this view, this way of thinking, generally appears to emerge. It comes up in all sorts of different ways. We can't escape it. I believe that one of the most significant dangers of an uncritical appropriation of the products of our digital age, including the use of the internet, engagement with social media, is that we risk subordinating our physical embodiment to an overemphasis on the mental or spiritual dimensions of our reality. So this last area is really the red light. When looking over the Franciscan tradition for resources, direction, and guidance in our present time, this is something that captures the attention of those aware of the need for discernment in living the gospel life in the digital age. Now, unlike several of the contemporary religious movements of his day, we got to go back in our time machine to that 13th century framework, that period. Francis's community of the lesser brothers and sisters did not espouse this Manichaean tendency to look down on the created world and on the human body. Instead, as exhibited in Francis's most famous text that we just looked at, the Canticle of the Creatures, Francis intuitively recognizes he wasn't a theologian, he wasn't a very learned person, but he got it mystically. He just had a sense of this, that all creation is sacred. The material world is not something to be disparaged or rejected, but to be embraced as part of the family of God's created cosmos. In his rule, Francis inserted a rather lengthy prayer, and he begins this prayer and thanksgiving with a threefold hymn of thanks. The first part is for God and God's self. He gives thanks to God for God. The second part is to give thanks for all of creation. And then the third is for the incarnation, through which Christ has redeemed and glorified us in the rest of the created order. The section on creation is important, for although it's short, it's brief, it reacts, I believe, in a direct way against this Manichaean tendency, this form of thinking. He says, "O God, you have created every spiritual and corporeal, you have created everything spiritual and corporeal. And after making us in your own image and likeness, you placed us in this paradise." Now, while many religious movements were preaching against the possibility that God would have created this physical world, this material world, Francis boldly reasserts the basic tenet of the faith. Those of us who worship in Christian communities on Sunday profess it every week, or almost every week, right? There we go. We believe in a God, creator of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen, visible and invisible, everything, the physical and the non-physical. Furthermore, Francis placed a tremendous emphasis on the significance of the incarnation. He saw the importance of the incarnation for creation in general and for us, for humanity in particular. Perhaps one of the most revealing passages from the early sources about Francis's understanding of the centrality of the incarnation is found in a collection of stories from the early friars who knew Francis. One of them goes like this: "For Blessed Francis held the nativity of the Lord in greater reverence than any other of the Lord's solemnities. For although the Lord may have accomplished our salvation in these other ones, nevertheless, once Christ was born to us, as Blessed Francis would say, it was certain that we would be saved. On that day," which was Christmas, of course, "he wanted every Christian to rejoice in the Lord, and for love of him who gave himself to us, wished everyone to be cheerfully generous, not only to the poor, but also to animals and birds." So I guess the bird bath is okay. Francis knew that the incarnation was the highest example of the reality that God created everything, things seen and unseen, and created them very good. In fact, so good was creation that God desired from all eternity to enter into this creation in a very particular and direct and unique way, to be in relationship with us as one of us. While oftentimes the passion, death, and resurrection of the Lord more readily captures the attention and imagination of Christians. Some of you may remember a film from about 13 or 14 years ago. It rhymes with the Smashing of the Christ by a certain actor from California. Let's call him Mel G. That's too obvious, I'll change it. Let's call him M. Gibson. That tends to capture the imagination of most Christians, but Francis challenges us to recall that every condition, or the very condition, everything that was needed, everything that's required for the resurrection and therefore for our salvation, occurs in the act of God becoming one of us through the incarnation. There is a popular temptation to forget the real humanity of Jesus Christ and to think of him simply as God in human clothing. But I've got news for you. That's a very old heresy. Instead, the truth is that God took on our very weakness and suffered our lowliness, as the Christological hymn of St. Paul in his letter to the Philippians proclaims. So this brings us to the topic at hand, the red light. While it seems like a concern reserved for the Steven Spielberg movies about artificial intelligence or to science fiction novels, the truth is that an overly dependent relationship on technology can promote a sense of disembodiment. Although such a stark experience of losing oneself in the digital world is hardly an everyday reality for some people, forgetfulness about what it means to be a fully integrated person is made more difficult by the omnipresence and multi-platform ubiquity of digital technology. So I tricked you when I said you can take out your iPhones and laptops. It makes it easier for us to forget. We see examples of this all the time, and I think we lament its unfortunate presence. Some of us at dinner this evening were talking about the fact that we need to set phones aside, set laptops aside, turn off the internet. But can we? Oh, it's so easy to not escape it. It's always there if we want it to. It's often there when we don't. From an initial glance around any given public space, office building, restaurant, or even church, I've seen it. It's okay, I gave permission here, but it happens. Few and fewer people connect with one another in real time or in physical ways. Instead, it's a matter of routinely, or to the point obsessively, checking the BlackBerries, checking the iPhones, checking the Droids, checking the internet, sending an email, collectively watching TV as a group instead of engaging in conversation with human communication. Imagine that. It's staying more and more in our heads instead of integrating our minds with our hearts and our souls and our bodies. That we are embodied, that we're here concretely in this space at this time is not accidental to who we are. To think so is to reinvent that Manichaean problem that's been going on and on, that comes back and sneaks up age after age after age. That we are embodied is exactly how God has created us to be, and as it says in Genesis, it is very good. There is perhaps more than can be said about this challenge, this red light that's presented to us in the digital age. But I think that just naming this, because I think this one strikes home to most of us, doesn't it? We know what it's like. You have the phantom vibrations of your phone that's not in your pocket. Have you had that experience? I don't need to say anything else. What Francis and his followers provide us with is a challenge to the entirely passive embrace of technology. It's way too easy. It's too present. It's everywhere. And I'm not saying it's inherently bad. On the contrary, contemporary theologians and different church leaders have made comments about the truly awesome reflection of human creativity in the emergence and development of technology. How awesome is it that in our lifetimes, so many things could happen? How awesome is it that in my lifetime, I can remember this not being the case, and I know people who are not that much younger than me who never remember a time without it. And how awesome is it that there are life-saving and connecting and visual ways for soldiers and sailors to connect with families, or business people overseas, or grandparents with their grandchildren across countries, crossing borders, crossing boundaries, crossing time zones. It is amazing. It is but one of the many iterations of our co-creativity. That is the vocation that we have, created in God's image and likeness. But what I think the Franciscan spiritual tradition tells us is we can't let the tail wag the dog, as the expression goes, and just allow ourselves to become enslaved to our digital creations. Sort of like Frankenstein, right? That we create this thing that ends up trapping us, enslaving us, trapped inside our own minds, and therefore becoming increasingly isolated from one another. Francis of Assisi made it very clear that what it means to be human and to follow in the footprints of Christ is to be an authentically human relationship, such that we mirror what God has done for us in becoming embodied and entering into our world as one of us. So to conclude, where does this leave us? Haven't I simply just tossed out some equivocating views that leave us without a singular approach? Haven't I just given you a bunch of maybe this or maybe that? Yes and no. Just confusing everybody. Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that on the one hand, there is no easy one-shot response or answer to the difficult and novel questions that arise as a result of these shifting dynamics in the digital age. But no, because I think there is much to consider here by way of understanding a markedly Franciscan contribution to thinking about new technology and its multiple uses. Like Aristotle's understanding of virtue as being found between two vices, so too the spiritual tradition that we have here in the example of Francis of Assisi, some 800 years later, is located between two opposing and extreme views. There are those on the one side that claim technology and new social media are to be avoided at all costs, that they are problematic, that they're useless to contemporary people of faith. If you really want to be faithful, if you want to be a good Christian, if you want to be a person of genuine religion, then why are you on Facebook? Why are you on Twitter? Why are you on this and that? But there are also those other people on the other side, right? Those who say that technology should be embraced wholesale without all that much discernment or reflection or consideration. And I think that both sides are incorrect, although each of them have it a little bit right. That's actually the definition of heresy, interestingly enough. Heresy is when you have part of the truth and mistake it for the whole truth. The technology to which we have access today and use in all aspects of our lives provides a wonderful opportunity for women and men of faith to engage in many different enterprises. Yet the same technology poses a potential threat to our spiritual lives and to our relationships, often serving as the location of online disputes and thoughtless electronic communication, mistaken texts and emails. How many times have we sent them to the wrong person, saying the very wrong things? It's leading to, as well, to an increasingly disembodied outlook on life. I sound like a cranky old man, but when I was a kid, I actually played outside with my brothers, with kids on the street. I know that's hard to believe because you look at me, many of you, and you say, you can't be older than 16. All you do is sit in front of the PlayStation. False. PlayStation wasn't around when I was a kid. But it is now, and so many other things are, and they're not bad in themselves either. Just like TV isn't bad in itself, or radio wasn't bad in itself when it came on the scene, or newspapers, or the printing press, or any other technology. But how do we engage it? The response that Francis of Assisi proposes to us is one rooted in this both-and approach that's so representative of the Catholic tradition. New technology and social media are both good and bad, and we have to live in that tension. That's the message. They are inherently open to whatever ends we direct their use. The same thing that could send a message that shames somebody or embarrasses somebody or bullies somebody is the same means that somebody could reach out and say a kind word to another person. So I have this question. If Jesus had been born in 1980 and began his public ministry around, we say 30 years, 2010 or so, maybe 2015, give or take, would he have friended the 12 apostles on Facebook instead of visiting the Sea of Galilee? I'll show of hands. Who thinks so? I can see you, remember? Had Jesus friended the apostles on Facebook, he probably would have been very quick to send an evite, right? Or a Facebook message or an invitation to a Facebook event or some other thing, a direct tweet that says, come here, to each one of them for an in-person gathering shortly thereafter. It's rather difficult to imagine the Last Supper taking place over Skype or Jesus healing the sick through text message. It is your faith that saves you, #healing, #Christ saves. Right? It's funny because it's really impossible. There are things for which we will never have a digital equivalent. But I cannot help but wonder whether we might find Francis of Assisi on Facebook or even Jesus on Facebook had they been born in our lifetime and not nearly a millennium ago or 2 millennia ago. Much like Francis of Assisi's admirer, The current Bishop of Rome is so present online today. If Francis were alive, Assisi that is, then I think he would be more like Francis of Rome, tweeting or having somebody tweet for him. If he didn't personally join Facebook or use Twitter or build a profile on LinkedIn, because Francis of Assisi would have been very concerned about his resume, then I imagine that those friars that followed him, who might have felt themselves compelled to go out past the borders of ministry, to reach out to others, to preach the gospel online, may have gone to him and asked for his blessing. In return, Francis of Assisi might give his approval as he did to St. Anthony of Padua, who, when Anthony asked if he could teach the other friars theology, something that seemed contrary to Francis of Assisi's original game plan of gospel living, Francis's response might read something like this, echoing his response to Anthony 800 years ago. I am pleased that you want to be present on Facebook and through other social media, providing that, as is contained in our rule or way of life, you do not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion during this activity. And with that, a new age of mission and ministry might have begun. Thank you.
Father Horan, for a wonderfully insightful and engaging talk with us. We'd like to open a few minutes of question and answer. We do have a microphone located right here in the aisleway and one at the front as well. So please feel free if you have any questions.
That's great. Yeah, I wish I had some sort of technology for the shy. You could tweet or text a question, but I don't have that. Yes. Yeah. That's. I think I can hear you.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I'm really interested in what role you see for the contemplative life. I've noticed that you've got some writing on Merton. So what role do you see of the contemplative stance in terms of dealing with or coping with or understanding the digital world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for those, did everybody hear that? The question in sum was really, what position do I see or what understanding do I have for the role of the digital world in the contemplative sense? Well, a couple things, and it carries still this theme of a both and. You mentioned Thomas Merton, somebody who a lot of my work is focused on, and somebody who I personally admire for his own writings and his own reflections. He has a very divided response to the question of technology, whether it's farming technology, whether it's atomic weaponry and missiles and the emergence of the Cold War shortly before the end of his own life, and that sort of thing. So he's very skeptical and hesitant. Yet at the same time, he published books and recognized that his own writing and the use of a typewriter, as simple as that, connected him to a number of other people. So I think on the one hand, there's a way that we can reach others that are unreachable otherwise and share and build in a sense of community. I know, although I haven't participated in, that there are a number of online communities that I think are probably more active than the original chat rooms, but I think they started this way more than a decade ago, where there are prayer communities online where people can pray the daily office together. They can check out webcams. I know for a fact you could look at a webcam of the chapel in the lower basilica of the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi. It's focused on his tomb, and you can see pilgrims come in to pray. You have a clear view of the altar and of Francis's own his where he's embodied or entombed rather, and so there's a sense in which you can leave this place to join with in spirit another community or to be in another place. One of the things that I see positively about that, a positive effect, is that it's maybe the closest thing we have to this worldly concrete illustration of another thing we profess every Sunday, which is the communion of saints. We believe that already we are connected with those who have come before us, all of us, as Lumen Gentium number 13, the document on the church from the Second Vatican Council says, all people scattered throughout the world as they are united in the Spirit through baptism. You're united in God's presence. We believe that we are connected somehow in the body of Christ. So if there is some way to reach out that way, I think that's a positive thing and something to be encouraged. I was speaking with somebody earlier this evening about psychological counseling in the way that people who would otherwise be isolated due to maybe physical or financial limitations or geography or weather can now reach out and connect with other people. And so there's something good to be said about that. I also think, though, and here's the other side, the flip side, that there's a reason for us to withdraw. Now, Francis of Assisi, in his own life, while not as rigorously divided as maybe the Benedictines or their relatives, the Trappists and others, in terms of work and prayer, labor and prayer, he did always find the need for solitude. And he never did that alone. He always took at least one brother with him and realized that you couldn't always be active and engage in active ministry all the time. In his time, that would have been walking from city to city or preaching or caring for people in a hospice or whatever it may be. There was need for withdrawing, for what we might call a hermitage experience, solitude and prayer, reconnecting with God in a focused, deliberate way. And the only way I think we can do that today is when we turn everything off. We can't do that. There's this impulse. I have this. I mean, when I'm on the computer writing, I'm on the computer doing something that has nothing to do with the internet, right? Just typing in a Word document. If I get distracted in the slightest way, the next thing I know, I've opened up an internet window, and I'm like on Facebook or something, or checking my email, and I don't intend to do it. It's just so habitual. And the only way to stop that is to pull the plug. The only way to stop that is to shut things down. So I think, it can aid in a sense of community and recognition of our solidarity as members of the communion of saints. But I also believe that there's time for solitude where in other places I've referred to it as making a date with God. We have to have some one-on-one alone time with our Creator, and we can't do that if we're tweeting the whole time. Sorry, live tweeters. Yes, sir.
Two questions, like a why and a how question. About this notion of withdrawal. I'm convinced that's the genius of Francis. Not just not touching money, but not picking up weapons.
Yeah.
The brothers could be serfs. He opted out of the feudal system. It seems to me that to embrace the internet ministry means I have to first buy into so much of language, of lifestyle. The local genius seems to be gone.
Yeah.
And it's very homogenized, very depressing. And then secondly, on the how thing, what, as opposed to embracing the everyday and God present in the world, it seems to me the internet is about objectifying banality. Right? Thank God weather replaced pornography, but now it's cat pictures. How
Yeah.
are we simply looking for the next best cat picture, as opposed to saying, here is the gospel being lived out in this life? Something inherent to the internet seems to be about objectification.
Yeah. Yeah, those are really two excellent points. Let me start with the second one first and then bring me back to the question about buying in if I lose track of that. As far as objectification and the banality that we find on there, I think, again, this is why we have to live and accept and embrace the tension of the both and not fall into either of one of those two extremes. The reason I say that is because we have to meet people, and this was part of that local genius that you were getting at. The local genius of Francis was to be in a locality, in a concrete historical setting with another person, to meet people where they are. And the reason why he didn't want to have a cloister in the traditional sense was because that's not where people were. They were in the marketplace. They were in the leprosaria. They were elsewhere. And they were in places where other people wouldn't want to go. They were in places perhaps where people made excuses not to go. And that can happen today. I'll give you an example. We have in my province one ministry in outside of Albany, New York, the capital of New York State. There's also in Cincinnati kind of an equivalent operation by the friars who live there, where there are these little chapels in huge malls. So the one that we have, there's actually one in Syracuse, New York, too, by the Conventual Franciscans. How could I forget that? Because that's the second, I think, biggest mall. There's the Mall of the Americas, and then there are these other things. This is like the Carousel Center or Destiny USA. I don't remember what it's called. It's gigantic. People laughed at that and thought it was ridiculous and stupid and trivial. What are you doing going there? And I think, isn't it in a sense, they would say, in line with what you're suggesting about buying into having to go online and being part of the system itself and playing with the language and to a certain extent going with it? Isn't that exactly what's going on in paying rent to a mall, a center of commerce, to a place where you can encourage people, is it a sign of endorsement of what's going on? Yeah. It is and it isn't, and that's what Benedict XVI and Bishop Herzog and others, Pope Francis too, with his embrace of Twitter. When Benedict talked about a digital continent, a new frontier, a new location, it's not a place in the sense that we are physically there, but it is a place where pretty much everybody in this room is at some point in their day. So how do you meet them? If they're not going to come to church, if they're not going to encounter you in another setting, are you just going to sit there and wait? I mean, there runs the risk of us creating our own kind of independent cloisters. Now, that's the one extreme, right? The one extreme is the complete disengagement. On the other hand is what I think I hear you expressing in terms of reticence or fear, which is, well, we can't go in wholesale. Like, there is something kind of absurd, something demeaning about it, and I hope I've acknowledged some of that rightly, too, which is this is an instrument as well, a reality, a place that is not unlike, perhaps, a shopping mall, that is something that objectifies people. It objectifies, it elevates the banality of life, cat memes, as you said. But the people who go to check on those cat memes, when do they encounter something else? I don't know. So I don't know that I have an easy answer, and that's part of this point, is that I think Francis of Assisi in his own time, 800 years ago, engaged with both of these things. Now, to your point about the nonviolence and opting out in that sense, he did, but you know what? What's interesting about my last point, in paraphrasing his permission that was given to Anthony of Padua, is that he changed his mind. And I think that's really important too, is that he realized, he was very dead set on the fact, and it was written in the earlier rule, that those friars who came into the order with a trade or with no education were not to seek education. If you were illiterate, you were not to learn how to read, because that could be used and held over others. But there came a point when they were the point people, they were the face of the church, they were the ministers encountering people with real needs, pastoral needs and theological questions, they had to have some training. And what Francis came to realize in his letter to Anthony, at least as he expresses it, is that there's a hierarchy of things that are important, a prioritization. And the spirit of prayer and devotion, this balancing the contemplative life with the active life, this returning to God and keeping things in perspective is what's most important. And so insofar as you can hold that tension and live in the both and, then you can do this. But I'm very much against any belief or interpretation of the Franciscan tradition that says that he was black and white in a way that it was exclusive in terms of engagement with people. And so I think it's uncomfortable. Like I said too, if Jesus were born 30 years ago and now was his public ministry time, I think he would probably also be in the digital frontier on the digital continent. But as I also said, I don't think he'd stay there. It's not okay to just stay there and buy in. I think you have to bring people together in the now, as you were talking about as well. I know that's not entirely satisfying, but yeah. Any other thoughts? I know it's getting a bit later. Maybe one more if anybody has. Okay. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite Linda Stout, Director of Education for the London District Catholic School Board, to offer a word of thanks.
Father Dan, on behalf of King's and the London District Catholic School Board, thank you. We are very pleased to be able to be a partner that has brought this here tonight. When you talked about connecting to faith and spirituality in the digital age, your low-tech and lecture style, thank you. You shared with us the wisdom of the Franciscan tradition, and you really got to the heart of it, and that is living the gospel life. And we're fortunate in Catholic education that that can permeate throughout all that we do in our entire curriculum. And there's no doubt whether you're an educator in primary, secondary, post-secondary, a parent or a grandparent, that's where our students are. They are on the internet, and we have to basically help them to navigate it so that they are living in this digital world, but living that gospel message. And that came through loud and clear, and that is what our challenge is. How do we evangelize using the tools that we have? I know those of us who are on Twitter, that I don't think there's a day goes by where we don't see a quote from Pope Francis. And when was a time that we could have said that that would have been that common? And I know our students are reading those messages, and they're taking note of it. It is making a difference. And again, the cautions that you provide us, whether it's the isolation or using technology, as with anything else, in the wrong way, we do have to pay attention to. And fortunately, we are able within our Catholic schools to do this within the gospel. So again, thank you for sharing with us, and this evening, thank you.
I'd just like to make two quick final announcements. Just to make note that each of the lectures are free of charge, but we always have a free will offering. The donation box is just around the corner on either side, inside the doors to the theater. And all of the proceeds are going directly toward the joint refugee sponsorship initiative that is between King's University College and Christ the King University Parish. There are already a couple of folks that have been sponsored, and some more in the works, an individual and hopefully upcoming a family. We will keep you posted on that. And I'd also like to note that the theme for next year's Veritas series for Faith and Culture is Dying and Rising, the Paschal Mystery. So we hope to have promotional information out by early June. Thanks again for joining us tonight.